Namaste and good morning, everyone. Let's do some prayers before we start our class. Om Guru Brahma, Guru Vishnu, Guru Devo Maheshwara, Guru Sakshat Parbrahma, Tasmai Shri Gurve Namaha. Om Bhur Bhavaswaha, Tat Savitra Varenyam, Bhargo Devasya Dhimahi, Dhiyo Yo Nah Prachodayat. अस्तो मा सद्गम्य तमसो मा ज्योतिर्गम्य मृत्योर्मा अमृतं गम्य ओम सहनावतु सहनौ भुनक्तु सवीर्यं कर्वावहै तेजस्विनावधीतमस्तु मा विद्विषावहै ओम शांति शांति शांति। Let's open our Uddhava Gita books. And we are going to start with the verse number 35 and 36 of chapter 16. And the title of this chapter is Enumeration of the Elements of Material Creation. So he has been explaining to us how this Srishti is created with these elements. So now Uddhava is asking a question in these two verses, 35 and 36. So 35 goes like this. Tvataha pravrit dhiyasva pritai karamabhi prabhu ucha suvyan yatha dehan vivanti visrijanti cha. Number 36. Tan mam akyahi govind durvi bhavyam anatmabhi nahi etat prayasho loke vidvansa santi vanchitaha. Shri Uddhava said, O Lord Govind, please explain to me how those who are averse to understanding the absolute truth accept and then give up different kinds of higher and lower bodies as a result of their fruitive activities. This is very difficult for the ignorant people of this world who are cheated by illusion to understand. So in other words, how do the Agyanis understand this whole creation? If one's intelligence is opposed to the devotional service of the Supreme Lord, then all one's activities simply create material bondage. As a result of engaging in fruitive activities, one is forced to accept higher and lower bodies and give them up when their allotted duration of life is over. This is the case for those who are averse to the Supreme Lord. No one can be considered intelligent without understanding the science of God, which includes a description of the negative results of those who have forgotten their eternal relationship with Him. There are many so-called wise men in the world, but although considering themselves to be most intelligent, they generally do not surrender to the supreme intelligence of the Lord. When the living entities fall down from the Lord's service and embrace Maya, they become dependent upon others for survival. Being conditioned by the external energy of Lord, they become falsely proud, thinking themselves to be the doers of the activities, and thus they are forced to suffer or enjoy the results. Due to aversion to the Supreme Lord, the living entities receive superior and inferior material bodies that force them to suffer the pangs of repeated birth and death. The conditioned souls are unable to understand their actual position due to their pride that is generated from false ego. The more one becomes attached to enjoying the fruits of his actions, the more one's aversion to the Lord becomes prominent. So let's see what Lord Krishna is saying to answer Arjuna. To Uddhava, Uddhava. Manaha karam mayam nrinam indrai panchupi yutam lokal lokam paryatyehe anye atma tad anuvartate. This is verse number 37. Lord Krishna said, the mind of the conditioned soul is formed by the reactions to his fruitive karma. Taking the conditioned soul with it, the mind travels throughout the universe. Although the soul is distinct from the material mind, it must helplessly follow it in conditional life. The subtle body, consisting of mind, intelligence, and false ego, takes the conditioned soul from one body to another. So this mind, intelligence, and the ego, it's the antakaran, or the suksham sharir. From one planet to another, according to the results of his fruitive acts. Although the spirit soul is distinct from the material mind, it is forced to follow it to its next destination. Demanding constant gratification, the material senses engage in activities under the control of the conditioned mind. The mind, whose only business is accepting and rejecting material objects for enjoyment, can only act with the help of the senses. The gross and subtle bodies are simply temporary designations of the eternal spirit soul. The spirit soul views the world from within his gross and subtle coverings, and as his mentality develops, he must transmigrate from one body to another. In conditional life, the tendency to accept the gross and subtle bodies as the self becomes very strong. And what else Lord Krishna says in verse number 38? Dhyayan manonu vishyan drishtan vanushrutan ath udhyat sidat karam tantram samritis tad anushamyati. The mind, which is bound by the reactions of fruitive activities, contemplates the objects of the senses that are found in this world, as well as those existing in heaven. Thus, the mind appears to come into being and then become annihilated along with its objects of perception, so that its ability to distinguish past and future is lost. The spirit soul always accompanies the subtle body. When the living entity is separated from the gross body, this is called death. His coming in contact with another gross body is called birth. In this verse, the Supreme Lord explains the cause of loss of memory. The mind under the control of karma always meditates on the objects of the senses, such as the beautiful women of this world and the celestial women of the heavenly planets. When the mind becomes fully merged in thought of a particular sense object, it will force one to accept a similar form in the future. At the time of death, the mind carries the conditioned soul into a woman's womb to develop another body that will experience another set of sense objects. Death causes the forgetfulness of one's past sensual activities, but it is the same mind that develops when one comes out from the womb. Okay, so the mind which we have been carrying with us, we don't know how many lifetimes, but we have forgotten. But the impressions of all those is stored. By always remaining absorbed in the thought of the objects of this material world, Either directly or indirectly, one loses his transcendental memory of his relationship with God. By identifying with matter, which is always undergoing transformation, forgetfulness of the self occurs. So that means not only our experiences of the past, but we have forgotten who we are. That is the forgetfulness of the self. In verse number 39, he says, Vishyaha abhiniveshen na atmanam yat samret punah jantor ve kasyachit dvetor mrityur atyant vismriti. When the conditioned soul quits his body to accept another body, according to his past karma, he becomes accustomed to his new situation and forgets everything that happened in his last life. Death means the complete forgetfulness of one's previous life. Due to full absorption in the present body, the mind does not remember the previous body, which may have been that of a demigod or a demon, according to the results of karma. Death means total forgetfulness of the previous gross body. When one's reactions of karma allotted to the present body are exhausted, death occurs. Because of full absorption in the objects of the senses, one's desires for sense gratification goes on increasing. Temporary forgetfulness of the objects of the senses occur at the time of death, which simply means that the conditioned soul is being transferred from one gross body to another. Verse number 40. Janam tva atam teya punsaha sarva bhaven bhurida vishehe savikritam prahur yatha swapana manoratha. O greatly charitable Uddhava, just as one may accept a dream or a fantasy as a reality, the acceptance of a new body as the self is called birth. The acceptance of a new body according to one's karma is called birth. Our identification with our own body and our blind acceptance of bodily relationships as permanent constitute a prolonged form of dreaming or fantasy in which one imagines oneself to be separate from the Supreme Personality of Godhead. The term birth, therefore, does not refer to the generation of a new entity, but to the blind acceptance by the spirit soul of a new material body. So imagination without practical action is called a daydream. The mental concentration that occurs in a sleeping state is called a dream. Dream and imaginations are insignificant states of existence, and they are similar to our state of wakefulness, where we accept perishable objects as being permanent. The only real difference is that our life of wakefulness lasts longer than any dream. Verse number 41. Swapnam manoratham chetyatham pragtanam na samartehe aso tatra purvam iv atmanam apurvam cha anupashyati. This is verse number 41. When a person dreams at night, he forgets his waking identity. Similarly, one who accepts the material body as the self, although eternal, forgets what kind of existence he previously had, thinking his present life to be all in all. Someone may claim that a dreaming person may sometimes remember a previous dream. The answer is that there are exceptions to the general rule that everyone forgets his previous lives. There is a mystic power known as Jati Smar, whereby one can remember his previous lives. Generally, however, one accepts this life as everything, having completely forgotten his past life. So that means there are rare people who do remember their previous lives. Okay? But very rare. Just as the memory of today's dream or daydream soon fades away and is forgotten when one has another dream or daydream the next day, because one is unable to remember his previous life, his birth appears to him to be the start of a new existence. So we think we just started life when we were born. 42. Indriyathan सृष्ट येदम त्रय विध्यम भाति वस्तुनि बहिर अंतर भिदा हेतु जनो सज्जन कृतयथा. Because the mind, which is the resting place of the senses, has created an identification with the new body, the material conceptions of a high, middle, and low class appear as if pertaining to the soul. In this way, the self creates external and internal duality. Just as a man might give birth to a bad son, a world of enjoyment is constructed in this life by the mind with the help of the senses. As a result of bodily identification, temporary considerations of superiority, inferiority, and intermediate arise. The father may be nature be peaceful, but because his bad son gets into trouble, the father is forced to defend his son and consider his son's enemies to be enemies of the entire family. Thus, the bad son implicates the father in troublesome conflicts. Similarly, the spirit soul has no intrinsic problems, but by creating a false identification with the material body, the soul becomes involved in the happiness and distress of the body. With this verse, the Lord summarizes his discussion of the difference between the body and the soul. Verse number 43. Nityada hi angbhutani bhavanti na bhavanti cha kalena lakshye vegena sukshmtvat tanna drishyate. My dear Uddhava, by the influence of the unseen time, material bodies are being created and annihilated at every moment. However, because time is so subtle, its actions are imperceptible. Just as time is imperceptible, the constant creation and annihilation brought about by time is not seen by the conditioned souls due to time's subtle nature. Next verse. Yathasya sham sarot samch phala nam vanaspate tathaiva sarva bhuta nam vayo vast adyaha krita. Just as by the influence of time, the flame of a lamp, the waves of a river, and the fruit of a tree constantly change, the age and condition of the material bodies of living entities also change. Although one's birth and death may not be seen at present, they can be understood by hypothesis. All material transformations are caused by the influence of imperceptible time. The examples given are the flame of a lamp, the movement of waves in a river, and fruit, which are always seen as changing, In the same way, birth and death can be perceived with relation to the material body, although the action of time is practically imperceivable. By observing the changes of the body from childhood to youth to old age, one can understand the subtle action of time. Birth and death take place by the subtle influence of time. The flickering flame of a candle sometimes waxes brightly and then again becomes weak and finally dies out. The waves of a river are endlessly flowing. The fruit of a tree gradually appear, grow, ripen, sweeten, and eventually rot and die. Similarly, one can easily understand that one's own body is undergoing constant transformation, and that the body is certainly subject to old age, disease, and death. So this is the change, because change happens in the material world. Constantly there are changes. Some changes we can perceive, the others we can't. But that doesn't mean that the nature of the Prakriti does not change. So this is the point he's trying to make over here. Verse number 45. So yam deepoho chirisham yadvad srot sam tad idam jalam so yam puman itin rinam mrisha gir dhir mrisham yusham. Just as an ignorant person says, this is the light of the lamp, and this is the water of the river. Even though the rays of light and water in the river are constantly changing, one displays his false intelligence by thinking that the particular stage of the body represents the actual person. Someone may say this is the light of the lamp, but factually, there are innumerable rays emanating from the lamp at every moment. Similarly, one may speak of the water of the river, but the fact is that different water passes by at every moment. In the same way, when we think that someone is a child, that is not the fact. The body transforms through various stages and does not indicate the actual identity of the indwelling soul. Whether in the body of a child or in the body of an old man, the soul is one and the same. As his body changes, a man may think that he has surpassed his previous condition. As the flame of a lamp gradually becomes dim as the fuel is burnt, and as the waves of a river take on different shapes, ignorant human beings accept the changing body as the constitutional nature of the self. Actually, the constitutional nature of the living entities never changes. So that means Atma never changes, soul never changes. Mundane transformations are temporary in nature. When the spirit soul's eternal, variegated pastimes are engaged in the service of the Supreme Lord, they do not create any distaste or abomination. Verse number 46. Ma swasya karam bije jayate so api ayam puman mriyate vamraho bhranteha yatha nagni daru sayukta. Just as fire is produced from wood and then is extinguished when the wood is completely burnt, the living entities who are eternal mistakenly think that they have taken birth as a result of their past karma and then die. When we burn some wood, it appears as if the fire is created at some point of time and then is extinguished when the fuel is spent. Actually, the element of fire continuously exists throughout the creation, although sometimes it is manifest So were eyes, and sometimes not. Similarly, the living entities are eternally existing, but because of our limited vision, it appears as if someone is born and then later on dies. The illusory condition of life is imposed upon the living beings as a result of their fruitive activities. But still, the living entities themselves remain essentially unaffected. Just as fire is ignited and then extinguished by contact with wood, similarly, according to his karma, a living entity is seen to undergo birth and death. Actually, the living entity is eternal and thus never is born nor dies. As fire is present within wood and then blazes forth and burns the wood, birth and death are manifested due to the performance of fruitive activities. In this verse, the living entities have been compared to fire, which is sometimes manifest and sometimes not. There is a difference between the activities of those who are inclined to Krishna's service and those who are averse to the Lord. The activities of the former enable one to enjoy eternal existence, whereas the activities of the latter keep one in a state of perpetual transformation. Verse number 47. निषेक गर्भ जनमाने बाल्य कुमार यौवनम वयो मध्यम जरा मृत्युर इति अवस्थास तनोर नव. The 9 transformations: impregnation, gestation, birth, infancy, childhood, youth, middle age, old age, and death only relate to the material body. So that means it does not belong to soul. Soul doesn't go through all these transformations, only the body, material body. The word nishek means to enter the womb of the mother. The word garabh means to grow within the womb. Janam means to come out of the womb. Balya means childhood up to the age of 5. And the periods from 5 to 16 years of age are called Kaumar, Poganda, and Kishore. The period from 16 to 45 years of age is known as Yovan. 46 to 60 is called middle age, and after that one is considered to be an old age, culminating in death. The 9 stages of the conditioned soul are impregnation, gestation, birth, childhood, youth, maturity, middle age, old age, and death. Verse number 48. Etaha manorath mayir yan sayon shvachasatanu gun sangad upadate kvachit karchid jahaticha. The living entity foolishly considers the superior or inferior positions that he has attained as a result of activities performed in the past to be his actual self. It is very rare that someone can give up such a false conception by the grace of the Supreme Lord. It has already been explained that birth and death are in relation to the material body and do not apply to the spirit soul. Because of being fully engrossed in material activities, the embodied soul foolishly identifies with his bodily condition. The result of one's karma in this life determines one's future body because it shapes one's mentality at the time of death. Only a fortunate soul who receives the Lord's mercy can give up the false egoistic conceptions of I am this body and everything in relation to the body is mine. So ahamta and mamta. It is only by the mercy of the Supreme Lord that one can release from the bodily concept of life. The Lord's mercy is causeless, and so there's always a chance of gaining relief from material existence. Verse number 49. Atmanaha pitrihi putrabhyam anumeyo bhavapeyo na bhavapeyah vastunam abhigyoho dve lakshanah. One gains an understanding of his own birth and death by observing the death of his father and the birth of his son. In this way, when one realistically understands the birth and death of all material bodies, he will no longer be subject to these dualities. One may question, is it a fact that the embodied living entity is the witness of all these changes of the material body? The answer is that by performing the funeral rites of one's father and by performing the rituals related to the birth of one's son, one can understand the certainty of his own birth and death. The word bhav in this verse refers to, or the verse bhav in this verse refers to birth, growth, and so on. One who is self-realized is not bewildered by the birth and death of the material body, knowing himself to be eternal. The eternal spirit soul is not by nature subordinate to the external energy of the Lord, nor under the control of time. However, those who are in the conditioned state of existence have artificially put themselves in such a situation. Birth and death, as described in this verse, refers only to the material body and not the eternal soul. A sober person, knowing the soul to be eternal, therefore gives up false identification with the temporary, unreliable body and takes shelter of the devotional service of the Lord. By this process, one can escape the artificial imposition of birth and death. Verse number 50. Taror bij vipakabhyam yo vidwan janam sanyamo taror vilakshno drashtaha evam drashta tano prithak. One who observes the growth of a tree from a seed and later on the death of the tree after maturity certainly is a distinct observer who is separate from the tree. In the same way, the witness of the birth and death of the material body is distinct from it. Here the word vipak indicates the final transformation called death. The rice plant dies just as at maturity, with no apparent dwindling as we see in the bodies of human beings and animals. One should carefully consider the nature of the material body and that of the observer, who is certainly transcendental to such changes of the body. As the seer of the seed tree and its fruit is different from such transformations, the embodied soul is the silent and neutral spectator of the birth and death of his gross body. The liberated soul very well understands this principle, whereas the conditioned soul falsely identifies with his body, even as it undergoes these transformations. The witness's distinction from visible objects is the subject matter of the liberated soul's realization. Verse number 51. Prakriter evam atmanam avichya buddhapuman tatven sparash samudaha sansaram pratipadyate. An unintelligent person who cannot distinguish himself from material nature considers the material manifestation to be real. By contact with it, he becomes completely bewildered and enters into the cycle of repeated birth and death. It may be questioned, how does a foolish person fall into material existence? Because a foolish person identifies himself with matter. He naturally becomes attached to his body and the objects of the senses. The conditioned souls who are fully absorbed in matter take pleasure in associating with the objects produced by material nature and thus enter deeper into material existence. Forgetfulness of the self makes him think that he is something that he actually is not. In this regard, one should carefully consider this verse from the Srimad Bhagavatam, which says, due to this external energy, the living entity, although transcendental to the three modes of material nature, thinks of himself as a material product and thus undergoes the reactions of material miseries. So, in other words, we have forgotten who we are. We think we are the matter. And that's why he says we are foolish. So, out of this foolishness or ignorance, we have forgotten who we are. Verse number 52. Sattva Sangad Rishin Devan Rajasur Manushan Tamsa Bhutam Triyaktvam Brahmito Yati Karamabhi. The living entities who traverse the path of material existence, being driven by the results of their karma, take birth as sages or demigods when the mode of goodness is prominent. So that means sattvikta. So more and more sattvikta, we raise ourselves up. When the mode of passion is prominent, they take birth as demons or human beings. And when the mode of ignorance is prominent, they take birth as ghosts or in the lower species. By the influence of the three modes of material nature, the forgetful living entities consider themselves as enjoyers and doers and thus receive various types of bodies, such as those of demigods, sages, demons, human beings, beasts, birds, and so on. Okay, so bodies are different, and according to the karma, we get the body, even though the Atma is the same, whether it's a tree or a ghost or a devta. Verse number 53. Nrityataho gayata pashyan yathav anukaroti tana evam buddhi gunan pashyan aneho api anukaryate. Just as a spectator sometimes imitates a singer or dancer, the spirit soul, although not actually the doer, but merely a witness, becomes captivated by material intelligence and thus imitates its activities. One may be attracted to a professional singer or dancer and then sing the song heard and imitate the dances seen, entering into the mood of the performer. In the same way, the conditioned soul imitates the dictations of the mind in an attempt to become an enjoyer of the material world. Such an attempt is doomed to frustration. However, the conditioned soul is similarly captivated by the concoctions of the material mind and intelligence, which convince him that he can become the enjoyer of the material world. Such an attempt is doomed to frustration, however, because the soul is never the doer of activities which are simply carried out by material nature, entailing repeated birth and death. As a foolish boy may imitate a singer or dancer but fail to do a good job, the witnessing spirit soul engages his body and mind in imitating the activities of enjoyment within the material world but fails to achieve satisfaction. 54 and 55, they go together. Yatha ambasa prachalataha tarvo api chala evam चक्षुषा भ्राम्यमानेन दृश्यते भ्रमतति वभु यथा मनोरथ दियो विष्ट शानु भवो मृषा स्वपन दृष्टाश्च दार्शने तथा संसार आत्मनः. The reflection of a tree on the water appears to quiver. When one spins around and around, the earth also appears to be spinning. While dreaming, the world that one sees appears to be real, although it is a concoction. In the same way, the soul's material life, his experience of sense gratification, is actually false, or descendant of Dasha. When one rides in a boat on a river, the trees on the bank of the river that are reflected in the water appears to be moving. In the same way, the bewildered, conditioned souls consider themselves to be the doers of activities which are in fact merely interactions of the external body with the modes of nature. Trees appear to be swaying when reflected in agitated water. And when one is sitting on a moving boat, the trees on the shore appear to be moving. Similarly, when the living entities become attracted to the external energy of the Lord, thus deviating from their constitutional position, they become bewildered and think themselves to be the doers and enjoyers. Let's end our class over here today. So we'll start with verse number 56 next week. Om Purnamada Purnamidam Purnat Purnamudachyate Purnasya Purnamadaye Purnameva Visheshyate Om Shanti 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 Om.